Welcome to Raven Wright Studio. This is the online tutorial for the Aussie Fedora leather hat. This hat is one of my favorites. It is a classic style with an Aussie twist. If you've purchased and downloaded the digital pattern, let's get started. Go to my profile to link to my site where I sell patterns if you haven't yet purchased it. If you're a beginner leather crafter, I recommend watching the video all the way through once before you start making the hat. First, open the digital file. Once the file is open, you'll see a page that has the layout of all the pages in the file once they're taped together. There may be 1 or 2 pages depending on the size of the pattern. There also might be a hardware list or a materials list explaining which items you need to make the pattern. And then following that are the different pages of the pattern that you print off and tape together to make the leather pattern. In order to print the pattern, go to File, and then go to Print. In the dialog box, you want to make sure that you change it to, in the properties, to black and white grayscale. That just uses the black and white ink. That way you don't have to worry about using any color ink. Make sure that the scale is set to none or 100%. That's very important so that the printer doesn't scale the pages down or up in any way. Then click OK and begin printing the file. I use an Epson inkjet printer. Any of my digital patterns can be printed out on letter 8.5 by 10 or by A4. And printed at 100% no scale, they can fit on either size of those papers. Once that's completed, one of the pages will be the key that shows how all the individual pattern pages are taped together. Then you can start cutting the pages in order to tape them together. I like to use a metal ruler and a sharp utility knife. So we don't need to cut that side, but we do need to cut this side. First, I'm going to check the key along the side, the legend that has 2 inches on one side and 5 millimeters on another. Check that with your ruler and make sure that the printer printed the pages at full size. Cut along each edge of the paper right on the dotted line. And we only need to cut the edges where the pattern connects to another piece of the pattern. Cutting right along the dotted line, you'll ensure that the pattern goes together correctly without any mistakes. So now I've prepared these 2 pages. When taped together, they'll look something like that. So now I'm going to go through and prepare the rest of the pages. Now it's time to tape. I use masking tape. Pull it to length. I trim it with my scissors. And I stick it on the back of the page. So that way I can line it up just right with the next page. Press it down so that it sticks well. And continue with the next pages. For the brim of the hat and the top of the hat, there are 4 pages total that go together. Also on part of those pages is the brim binding, so you'll need to tape that to some other parts of the pattern. Once those 4 are taped together, that gives you the top and the brim. Next, using our sharp utility knife, we'll cut out around the pattern, not right up to the line. We'll leave a little bit of white space between the edge of the paper and the line of the pattern. Save that piece because we'll still need to use it for the pattern. You can see I'm cutting out and still leaving a millimeter or 2 of white space between the line and the edge of the paper. Now we'll cut out and finish and tape together the rest of the pages of the pattern. On these long straight pieces, I like to cut right on the edge using my ruler. So on this, I'm not going to leave extra space between the edge of the paper and the line. And that's because I'm going to use a strap cutter to cut these long, narrow pieces the exact length. If you don't have a strap cutter, I recommend leaving a little bit of space like I did before between the line and the edge of the cut where you're making. That way you can tape it right to your leather and cut it out. But if you have a strap cutter of some kind, you can cut the leather to length and then tape it to your pound board, and I'll show you how to do that later in this video. On the ends, I do leave a little bit of white space, and I cut the length of the strap a little bit longer. So here is what I mean. Okay, take the cut strap and then tape it directly to the pound board, lining the pattern up on the edges very carefully. And I line them up carefully and tape them down at the areas where the pattern is taped together with, and that just helps make sure that everything's lined up and straight. And then I use another piece of tape to tape the middle section down as well. We don't want that pattern shifting around at all while we're hammering the holes. So now we're going to use a piece of a tea candle, so it's wax, and I rub it down on the holes, and it helps lubricate the pattern for the hole punch. So this is my 1.5 millimeter hole punch, and I'm going to punch out each one of these holes. You can easily use a multi-hole punch if you like. Most of my holes are 6 millimeters apart, so if you're going to buy a multi-hole punch, find one that is 6 millimeter spacing. I like to be really exact, and I like to use the single hole punch, but I know it drives some people crazy. So it's unlikely your pound board will be long enough to do the entire length of this piece, long piece. So you just have to move it along the pound board. Next, I'll use a straight cutting piece to cut the edge really straight. And I'm going to put in the last 2 holes before I unstick it. Now let's move on to the top of the hat and the brim. You've got that taped down to the leather, and I'm going to use my wax tea candle piece again and go over the hole line, the stitch lines. And now I'm going to mark the holes using an awl, and on the pattern there are locations where it says to attach this piece to that piece, and I mark that hole, and it's just marked with a little bit of a dot, but not right on the stitch line, so you can see where that hole is. I go ahead and punch out the remainder of the holes. Next, using my sharp utility knife, I cut right on the line this time. So that's why we saved a little bit of extra, so that when we taped it down, we could then go back and cut right on the line. We want to make sure we do that carefully. We don't want to cut into the stitch line where our holes are. So we carefully cut on the line, and we do that for all the pieces of the pattern. So sometimes there's a little bit of sticking when you've cut, and you want to cut with the knife. You don't want to pull and tear any of the leather. Next, I'm going to show you how I like to dye this hat. You can do it anyway, of course. I used light brown Fibings Pro dye. And I'm going to use a clean white rag. I use my awl. I make a small hole in the foil lid of the container. And I pour a little bit of the dye into the cap. And I'm going to use the rag and dab it in the ink. I don't want it too wet. I want to make it sure it's not too damp, because I want some of the texture of the rag to come off in the stamping. And then I kind of dab and stamp at the leather. And I go through this, and as I put it in, it's pretty dark. And then as it dries, it lightens up a little bit. But this technique adds some texture and depth to the color of the dye. Next, I'm going to use the dark brown Fibings Pro dye. And we're going to do the exact same procedure. And this time I'm going to particularly dye at the edges, the top and the bottom, to approximate a vintage or antique look. And then I add some more color kind of by wiping instead of by dabbing at this point, and just kind of darken the edges up an additional amount. And that's what it looks like when it's done. Next, I'm going to add pure neat's foot oil, and I'm going to rub it into the leather. When you've dyed leather, sometimes it can stiffen it and take out some of the flexibility and moisture. And so we want to add that back in by adding additional oils to the leather. And I'm actually going to use quite a bit. I'm going to rub it in, and you can see it looks like I've just ruined the dye job, but I haven't. Over time, you let this soak in, and it actually pulls the pigments deeper into the leather and lightens up. So I'm going to let that sit for several hours, probably up to overnight, and it will lighten up quite a bit and have a different, much better texture and color at the end. That's what it looks like overnight. Next, we're going to begin to sew. I'm using this golden colored thread. I think it just matches the colors in the dye of the leather. And they will also stand out a little bit on the darker color of the leather. I like to lock in the threads on my leather so that the needles don't slip off as I'm sewing. And that's what I'm doing here. I put the thread through the eye of the needle, and then I put the tip of the needle through the thread twice and slide it down. And that's called locking in the thread. Now I'm going to sew the center line of the 3 stitch lines on the back of the crown. And the center line will actually not be visible once the hat is completely made, because we're going to stitch down the seam allowance, and this is called a French stitch. So the center line is where the hat is physically connected together, and the other 2 stitch lines will conceal it. I'm using a standard saddle stitching technique, and it takes some practice to make it look clean, but one of the things that helps make a saddle stitch look neat is that you place the needles in the same direction each time. So on one hand, I'm placing the needle closer to me, and the other hand, I'm placing the needle further from me in each stitch. And that helps the front and the back of the stitch look nice. Now I'm back stitching a couple of stitches. I usually do this 2 or 3 times. And this is Ritza Tiger thread. It's a waxed polyester thread specifically made for hand sewing leather. It's one that I prefer. There's some other great thread out there as well. But because it's polyester, once I've done this back stitch, I can use a thread burner or a lighter to burn down the thread into the hole. So I'm going to use this thread burner, and it's just a little wire with heat, and it cuts and burns the thread at the same time, and it softens that little tail, and I just push it down into the hole with the back of the thread burner, and that creates a nice hold on the thread on both sides of that hole. Next, I'm going to use these little pins that you can find on the internet. They're pretty common. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use them to hold down one edge of the leather and then sew the other edge of the leather. So this makes complete the French seam. And I'm going to use these pins, these stitch holders, just to hold one section of the leather in place while I sew the other. I put 4 of those holders in. You can see now I'm going to use my thread and sew on the stitch line next to it. I'm using the same saddle stitching technique. This stitch line will be visible once the hat is complete, so you want to make it as neat as you can make it. And you can see I've already popped one of those stitch holders off, and that's not super important. It's just an aid into holding that one piece of leather out of the way while I sew the stitch line adjacent to it. So if you don't have those stitch holders, and you can use a clip, or you can even do it without those. I just found it a little easier on this leather because this leather is a little stiff. And once I get to the bottom, I'm going to backstitch the same way we did before, about 2 or 3 stitches. And then I'm going to use the thread burner just like the previous stitch, and there's one side of the French seam. Do the next side exactly the same way, and that's what it looks like when it's done. So now I'm going to turn it back inside out. And the next thing we're going to do is attach the top to the hat. So attaching the top to the crown, we're going to use this piece of leather, this veg tan leather, and it doesn't have any dye or finish on it. And we're going to get it wet, quite wet. Much wetter than if you were going to tool this leather if you're used to tooling. We want it completely saturated with water. And what we're doing by getting it wet is that we're going to sew it in place, and as it dries, then it will stiffen up and form in the position we sewed it, and it will help give the hat some shape. You can see how wet I got it by how much water is left over. The next thing we're going to do is just kind of fold it in half lengthwise. And we want the flesh side on the inside of the fold and the finished side on the outside. And so I'm looking for the dots that I made with the awl that shows where the top and the crown meet. And then I'm going to begin sewing where I made those dots. So if you're confused at all, you can go back to the pattern and look at where the each piece of the pattern is matches up with the other pieces to sew up. I've tried to make that as clear as possible on the pattern. And this is the same style of stitch. We're going to use a saddle stitch again, but once again, we're going to be stitching through actually 4 layers of leather. So the binding strip will be on the outside, and the 2 layers of the crown and the top will be on the inside. We're going to stitch through the 4 layers using a basic saddle stitch. And it may be a little trickier to line up the holes, but take your time. It's not a race. And sometimes you have to line up each little hole in the leather individually. But once you get started, it goes faster. And I'm going to do the same saddle stitching all the way around. And if it's taking you longer and the leather starts to dry, that's okay. Just add some more water to that strip of leather. So here we are at the end, finishing it off. I'm going to back stitch a couple of times. And I'm using the thread burner to finish. So now what we want to do is form any irregularities out of it just by kind of pinching. And we're going to let that sit and dry for at least a few hours, depending on the humidity of your location, and you might need to let it dry overnight. Next step is we're going to cut this wire to length. This is a 2mm or 16 gauge wire. It's available at the typical home improvement stores, and it's called ceiling suspension wire, or you can find any other wire you prefer. If you want to use a lighter gauge wire, you can. I like this 2mm wire, 18 gauge. It's just pretty sturdy. And this is the edge binding of the brim. So we're going to go ahead and add 3 or 4 stitches at the beginning and then slide the wire in. You can see on this, I'm starting at the second stitch back, the second hole from the edge. I pull the thread so it's even on both sides. And then I go to the first hole. I sew that in place with 1 stitch. For me, getting started on a stitch line is always the hardest. Once I get going, it's easier. So I pull that first stitch, and then I'm going to go back to the second hole and make that first stitch a double stitch. And it just adds some additional strength in certain places to do a double stitch like this. And this is an area where there might be some tension in the leather and the thread because of the wire. And I'm carefully putting the needles through so that I don't catch the thread that's already gone through the holes once with the point of the needle. Because if you do that, that can make the stitch catch and you pull the thread through and it's just a mess. So I'm being extra careful to make sure that I don't catch the thread that's already in the hole. Okay, got that first stitch. And so now we are stitching through 3 layers of leather. Take your time, line up the holes, make sure that you do a nice clean saddle stitch, that the needles go in the holes in the same direction each time for a nice consistent stitch. And I like to do a double needle through the hole. That just makes it so that the stitch or the needles are less likely to catch on the thread if you do both needles at the same time. But sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes you need to pull one side all the way through and then do the other. You just need to be careful and make sure you don't poke the tip of the needle through the thread that's already in the hole. Okay, we've got 3 or 4 stitches there, and we're going to put the wire in place. And I'm going to just shape it by hand to make sure it looks as good as I can get it before we start stitching the rest of the way. And now I'm going to saddle stitch the rest of this binding onto the brim. Okay, I went ahead and stitched all the rest of that, and now I'm finishing by back stitching and burning the thread. And the next step will be to add one last stitch to the binding where the 2 pieces meet. There's holes in the pattern, and where the 2 ends meet, I add one more stitch just to hold it closed so the wire doesn't ever poke out or become visible. If you wanted to conceal that stitch, you could add a matching thread, a darker thread, and it would be less visible. But I'm going to continue using my golden thread. And I'm just going to go over it twice, make it a double stitch so that it holds securely. Enter the thread burner one more time. And it's important to make sure that you burn the same hole, either side of the same hole, because that will help hold the stitches in. if they've got the burned and compressed piece of thread. Okay, it's been overnight and this is dried. The next thing we're going to do is turn it back right side out. And because that leather is dry and stiff, it's going to take a little bit of effort. But it's worth the effort because it helps the hat really hold its shape. And I'm going through and I'm just pushing on that seam, make it tight. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually use a hammer to make sure that that seam is the shape I want it and that it's pulled all the way through once we've turned it inside out. If you've used a softer piece of leather, you may not need to do that. Now the top and the crown are complete. One thing that's optional is there are holes on the hat in the crown for eyelets or grommets. Those are two words for the same thing. And I'm using 6mm grommets, and I'm just going to use the pattern and an awl to poke right through the center to mark where the grommets go. You can see the mark for the hole on the pattern. And this can also be done earlier if you've planned ahead and you want to add the grommets. This can be done at the same time that you're punching holes for the stitch line. And I wanted to demonstrate that this could be done later. So now that I've made those marks, I'm going to demonstrate how to punch a hole in a piece of a hat you may have already made. So I'm going to use an anvil and a piece of wood. And I'm using my 6mm punch. It takes a little bit more punching than using the punch board, but it works. And we do that on both sides. Next, we're going to set the grommets. And there's a couple different ways you can set grommets. They can be set with a hand tool and a hammer and the anvil, or they can be set with a press like this. I prefer this press. I notice I make less mistakes with the press and it holds a little better. But if you don't have a press, it can certainly be done by hand. And I did all 4 holes, and that leaves you a little bit of air at the top. You can get some vent when you're wearing the hat in warmer weather. Next, I'm going to seal the leather. At this point, before we sew it all together, I use EcoFlow Super Sheen. It's the finish that I like. It's easy to apply. You dampen a sponge and bring out the water. And you add a little bit of the sealer to the sponge. And you just rub it all over. And on the crown and top, we don't want to seal the inside. We're just going to seal the outside, and I'll show the reason for that at a later step. So you want to seal the crown and brim, the crown and top, and also the brim. But on the brim, we want to seal both sides. And the flesh side of the brim takes more sealer than the finished side. So we're going to, after it's dried, I like to add a second coat. But before I add that second coat, I'm going to take a soft piece of felt and I'm going to burnish the leather. This just adds a little bit of shine to that sealer and cleans it up just a little bit. I live in a pretty dry climate, so you saw that it took just a minute or two for that to dry. But depending on where you live, if you live in a more humid climate, which is likely, there's not much drier place than where I live, it's going to take longer to dry. And I'm going to add the second coat. It usually takes less sealer on that second coat because it's already been soaked into the surface of the leather. So just add a little bit more. And the nice thing about this EcoFlow Super Sheen is that it dries really clear, it soaks in really well, and it doesn't leave any bubbles or swirls. Okay, the next step is to prepare the liner. This is the sweatband to line the bottom of the hat of the crown on the inside. And we're going to do the same French stitch as we did on the crown itself. So I sew the center line together, backstitch a couple of times, use my handy thread burner. You can use a lighter. You just cut it off and burn it with a lighter if you choose. And then sew down each side in the French seam. On this, I'm using a slightly different color of thread. This is a medium brown, and it just matches the particular leather I picked for the sweatband. This is a piece of goat suede, about 2 ounces, pretty thin. And it's just there to add comfort on the inside of the hat. There's the first French seam. And once it's done, then we sew the hat, the brim, and the crown together. I didn't make you watch me. I'll do all the stitching, but here I am finishing it. So we're sewing the sweatband into the crown, with the brim at the same time. The brim goes on the outside, the crown in the middle, and the sweatband on the inside. So I do the last couple of stitches and back stitch like normal. Finishing by burning off the tails of the thread and pressing them in place. So you can see the exterior of that stitch line. Next step, we're going to work on the hat band. The hat band, once again, has the same French seam as the first steps of the hat. So we sew the center line, sews the two ends together, and then I'm going to use a new piece of thread, pretty short, and sew down the French seam on each side of that center seam. Okay, that's what it looks like when completed. And it goes over the hat like that. And I like to sew the hat band in place so it doesn't slide around. And I just match up the French seam holes on the crown with the French seam holes on the hat band, and I do one stitch on each line of the French seam. So 2 stitches in total at the top of the hat band. So I'm going over that stitch one more time. And this can be a little tricky as we've already got some thread in those stitch holes, but it's doable. So that first stitch is in place, and we burn the tail just like we do on all the other stitch lines, inside and out. And we do the exact same thing on the stitch line adjacent to it. Just one stitch. That just helps hold the hat band in place. And then there's one location, 2 holes for a stitch right in front. And I'm using a matching stitch so it's not super visible. It's a little more hidden right there in front. And that helps affix the hat band to the front of the crown. And I go over it twice. It's a double stitch. Whenever I have just 2 holes, a single stitch, I go over it twice to make it a double stitch. And in this time, I'm going to tie a little square knot instead of burning it on either side. You could still burn it on either side, but if you tie a little square knot, that little burn won't be as visible. Pull it tight and use the thread burner to burn the extra length of the tails off and create a kind of fat bulb at the end of the knot so that it won't pull through. Okay, the hat is now all sewn together. The build is nearly complete. The next step is optional. You could be done with the hat at this point, if you chose so. One of the things I really like in this style of hat is finger dimples. And that's where you put dimples on the crown of where your fingers would go if you put it on. And so I'm going to put a little bit of water on the inside of the crown. So remember how we didn't seal the crown on the inside and the top? So now I can use my hands to form some finger dimples into the leather. And I crease the top a little bit. And I want to make it just so. And then it needs to dry. Because this is veg tan leather, it will hold its shape after molding it with while it's wet. Okay, after that's dried overnight, it's done, it's firm, it holds its shape. The next thing I'm going to do is shape the wire and the brim the way I like. I like to curl up the sides, and I like to pull down the front and the back. And that's kind of the Aussie style. So because of that malleable wire, it will hold its shape in however you bend it, and you can change it if you don't like it. So this is several views of the hat now that it's complete. Thank you for building a hat for me with me and going all the way to the end. If you have any questions about the pattern or the video, please reach out to me through the store where you bought the digital pattern. I won't be answering questions at the end of this video, but through the store with customer support, I can answer your questions.